Your first memory is probably fake. That birthday, that beach, the dog you had when you were tiny, the earliest scene you can still see in your head. There's a very good chance your brain invented it, not blurred it, not exaggerated it, built it from scratch, and filed it away as something you actually lived. This video is about the two things your brain did to the first years of your life that almost nobody talks about. It destroyed the real memories, and then it quietly replaced some of them with forgeries you can't tell apart from the truth. Because here's the part that gets me. You didn't fail to record your childhood. You recorded all of it. And then your brain went back and rewrote the tape. Let's start with what happened to the real ones, because the disappearance itself is not what you'd guess. You lived an entire life before the age of 3. You opened your eyes for the first time. You heard your mother's voice, took your first steps, said your first word, and you remember none of it. In 1905, Sigmund Freud gave this a name, infantile amnesia, and for most of a century, everyone assumed the explanation was simple. The baby brain is too undeveloped to make memories. But that turned out to be wrong, because babies absolutely can make memories. In the 1980s, psychologist Caroline Rovi-Collier tied a ribbon from a baby's ankle to a mobile above the crib. The babies learned fast that kicking made it move, and days later, they remembered. They started kicking the instant they saw it. 2-month-olds could hold that memory for days, 6-month-olds for weeks. So, the infant brain records, stores, and recalls. The memories were there. Something came along and destroyed them. And the first culprit is structural. The hippocampus, a small curved structure deep in your brain, is the engine that turns a lived moment into an episode you can replay later. In adults, it works with the prefrontal cortex to tag and file each experience. In infants, that whole system is still under construction. The wiring between the hippocampus and the cortex isn't finished. A gateway region called the dentate gyrus isn't fully built until somewhere between ages 2 and 4. So your baby brain could hold a memory for a while. It just had no reliable way to move it into permanent storage. But the strangest culprit came in 2014. 2 neuroscientists in Toronto, Sheena Joslin and Paul Frankland, tested an idea that sounds almost cruel. What if the very thing that builds your brain is also what erases it? In your first years, your hippocampus is producing new neurons at a furious rate, a process called neurogenesis, and it's essential because those cells wire up the circuits you use for life. But every time a new neuron muscles into an existing circuit, it disrupts the connections already there, the connections holding your memories. They tested it in mice. Crank neurogenesis up in adult mice, and the mice started forgetting things they'd already learned. Slow it down in infant mice, and those infants held on to memories far longer than normal. The conclusion, published in Science, was backwards from everything we'd assumed. Your baby brain didn't lose your earliest memories because it was too weak to keep them. It lost them because it was too busy growing, building new rooms, and tearing down the old walls in the process. And there are 2 more layers, and they matter for where this is going. To store the kind of memory where you are the main character, an experience you can replay from the inside, you first need a sense of self. You have to understand that you exist as a person separate from the world. Psychologists Mark Howe and Mary Courage showed that this sense of self doesn't switch on until roughly 18 months. Put a dot of rouge on a baby's nose in front of a mirror, and before that age, they reach for the reflection, not their own face. They don't yet know the baby in the glass is them. And the moment self-recognition switches on, lines up almost exactly with the earliest age real autobiographical memory becomes possible. On top of that, there's language. Developmental psychologist Catherine Nelson found that words don't just describe memories, they give them a skeleton to hang on. Before you could speak, your experiences were raw sensory impressions with no framework to attach to, like water with no container. They existed for a moment, then ran through your fingers. So put it together, because it's the same convergence we keep running into. It was never one thing. Your hippocampus couldn't file long-term memories. The flood of new neurons shredded the ones it managed to make. You had no stable self to anchor experiences to, and you had no language to give them a shape that could survive. Four forces, all at once, all erasing in the same direction. Which is why every single person you have ever met walks around with a black hole where the first years of their life should be. But now we arrive at the part nobody warns you about. If the real memories were destroyed this thoroughly, then look back at that vivid first memory you started with, the birthday, the beach, the dog. Where did that come from? Because it can't be the original recording. That footage was overwritten years ago. And yet, the scene is right there, clear as anything. So what are you actually looking at? The uncomfortable answer is that your brain made it. In the 1990s, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus ran one of the most unsettling experiments in the history of memory. She and her team sat adults down and walked them through 4 childhood events supplied by their families. Except one of the 4 was completely invented. A story about getting lost in a shopping mall as a small child, frightened and crying, before a kind stranger reunited them with their parents. It never happened, but after being asked to recall it a few times, about a quarter of the participants remembered it. And they didn't recite it flatly. They elaborated. They added the stranger's flannel shirt, the fear, the smell of the store, rich, confident sensory detail for an event that was pure fiction. Their brains hadn't retrieved a memory. They had built one and then handed it over as if it were real. And this isn't a lab trick that only works on a few people. In 2018, a team led by Shazia Akhtar and memory researcher Martin Conway surveyed more than 6,000 people about their single earliest memory. Nearly 40% of them reported a first memory from age 2 or younger. Hundreds claimed memories from their first year of life. And here's the problem. Given everything we just covered about the infant's brain, those memories are, in the researcher's word, fictional. They cannot be real recordings because the machinery to make a lasting recording that early simply did not exist yet. 40% of people are confidently remembering something that neurologically cannot be remembered. The memory feels exactly as real as any other. It's just not a memory of an event. It's a memory of a story. Because that's where these forgeries come from. A photograph you've seen 100 times. A tale your family retold at every dinner. Remember when you did this? You were so little. A home video. Your brain takes those fragments and, being a relentless little storyteller, assembles them into a first-person scene, complete with sights and feelings, and files it in exactly the same drawer as your true memories. This is called a source monitoring error. And the terrifying thing about it is that from the inside, there is no tell. You cannot feel the difference between a memory you lived and a memory you constructed from a photo. They arrive with the same warmth, the same certainty, the same "this is mine." There is no label, there is no watermark. The forgery and the original are stored on identical paper, which leaves you with a genuinely strange question about your own life. The earliest thing you can remember, the very foundation of your personal story, the first frame of you, is quite possibly something your brain wrote after the fact, from other people's accounts, about a child whose actual memories had already been dismantled and paved over neuron by neuron. The baby in those photos didn't just forget their life. In a real sense, that baby isn't storing anything you have access to at all. The you that remembers them is a later author, working from second-hand sources, filling the gap with a story good enough to believe. So the answer to why can't you remember being a baby was never really about a gap. It's about what your brain does with a gap. It refuses to leave it empty. It reaches for photographs and family legends and half-heard stories, and it quietly builds you a beginning, because a person needs one. Your first memory feels like the bedrock of who you are. But bedrock isn't supposed to be something you invented. And if your brain will forge the very first chapter this convincingly, and you'd never know, it's worth asking how much of the rest of what you swear you remember was ever really there at all. which, as it happens, is exactly the question we're going to open up next.